Ethan Walker had buried 3 people he loved and sworn he'd never let another soul close enough to hurt him again. Then he found her face down in the summer dust, fingers locked around something she refused to let go of, even in unconsciousness. When he carried her inside and reached to tend her wound, she grabbed his wrist with every ounce of strength she had left and whispered, "Don't take it off. Please. Don't ever take it off." He didn't understand then. He would. And when he did, it broke him wide open. If this story already has you feeling something, hit that subscribe button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The summer of 1884 had been brutal to the mountains of Montana. The grass along the lower ridges had gone yellow and brittle by June. The creek that ran behind Ethan Walker's cabin dropped to half its width. Even the elk had moved higher, chasing shade and cooler air, and Ethan had followed them up the eastern slope 3 mornings running without luck. He was coming back down empty-handed the afternoon he found her. His horse Ranger stopped first. The animal threw his head, ears pinned flat, and planted all 4 feet like he'd walked into a wall. Ethan didn't argue with Ranger. The horse had better senses than most men he'd known, and he'd learned years ago to trust that. He swung down from the saddle and led Ranger by the reins, moving slow along the switchback trail that cut down through the ponderosa pines. The heat pressed in from every direction. Sweat had soaked through the back of Ethan's shirt 2 hours ago and dried to a stiff salt ring. Then he saw the white cloth. It was caught on a juniper branch about 10 feet off the trail, fluttering in the thin, hot breeze. A strip of fabric, maybe torn from a sleeve, pale against all that sun-scorched brown. He might have walked past it. He almost did. But Ranger pulled sideways, and Ethan followed the line of the horse's gaze down the slope. She was on her side in the loose rock and pine duff below the trail, one arm folded beneath her, the other stretched out like she'd been reaching for something when she went down. The dark fabric of her dress blended with the ground. If Ranger hadn't stopped, Ethan might have ridden 20 feet past her and never known. He tied Ranger to a branch and picked his way down the slope. She was alive. He could see the shallow rise and fall of her back before he even reached her. Younger than him by at least a decade. Brown hair that had come loose from its pins and spread across the dirt. Her dress was torn at the hem, caked with dust. One of her boots had a broken heel, the leather cracked clean through. She'd been walking a long time in those boots. Ethan crouched down and put 2 fingers to the side of her neck. Her pulse was there faster than he'd like, and her skin was hot from the sun. Too hot. He looked around. No horse, no pack, no sign of a camp anywhere on the slope. There was a small leather bag, old, worn, soft at the corners, clutched in her right hand, the one folded beneath her. Her fingers were locked around the strap so tight the knuckles had gone pale. He didn't touch the bag. He didn't touch anything for a long moment. A woman alone in the mountains in July. No horse, no supplies on a trail that didn't lead anywhere. Most people had reason to go. That wasn't an accident. That wasn't a woman who'd wandered off from a picnic. She was either running toward something or away from something. In Ethan's experience, it was almost always away. He could ride on. He'd done harder things than ride past trouble. He'd buried his wife and his brother in the same year, watched his father's land get swallowed by a banknote, and rebuilt himself from nothing on 40 acres of mountain nobody else wanted. He knew how to walk away from things that weren't his problem. His father's voice came to him anyway, the way it always did when he was about to make the wrong choice. A man's character isn't what he does when people are watching Ethan. It's what he does when there's nobody around to see. He slid his arms under her shoulders and knees and lifted. She was lighter than she should have been. That worried him more than anything else. She came around part way while he was getting her up across Ranger's back, and the sound she made wasn't a word. It was something between a gasp and a sob, the sound of someone surfacing from very deep water. "Easy," Ethan said. "You're all right. I've got you." Her hand shot out and grabbed his forearm. Her grip was surprisingly strong for a woman who'd been lying unconscious in the dirt. "Don't," she started. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. "I'm taking you to my cabin. You need water and shade. and you need them now." She didn't let go of his arm. Her eyes weren't all the way open yet, just slitted against the light, but he could feel her trying to focus on his face. "Who are you?" she said. Her voice came out thin and cracked from the heat. "Ethan Walker. I've got a place about a mile up the ridge." He kept his voice level, the same voice he used with a spooked horse. "You're safe." She made a sound he couldn't interpret. Not agreement. Not refusal. Just a sound that said she was still present, still fighting to stay that way. He got her situated across the saddle as gently as he could manage, and led Ranger up the slope by hand. The horse moved carefully, like he understood the weight he was carrying. The cabin was plain and practical the way Ethan liked things. He'd built it himself after he'd come to the mountain. One main room, a separate lean-to for storage, a good stone fireplace that drew well even in summer when you needed it for cooking. He'd added a second window last spring for the light, and there was a narrow iron-framed bed along the east wall that he never slept in anymore, preferring the pallet on the floor near the fireplace out of habit more than anything else. He got her inside and onto that bed, and she stirred again when he set her down, blinking up at the low ceiling. "Water," he said. "First." He poured from the clay jug on the table. He'd brought it up fresh from the creek that morning, and held it for her while she drank. She drank too fast, choked, drank again. "Slow," he said. She slowed. When she'd had enough, she turned her face away from the jug and lay back and just breathed for a moment. Her color was still bad, but better than it had been on the slope. He looked at her more carefully, now that they were inside. She was in her mid to late 20s, he thought. Fine-boned face, a kind of quality to her features that said she'd been raised somewhere with enough money for proper schooling. Her hands told a different story. There were calluses there, and the nails were broken short, and the palms were scratched raw. She'd been working hard for a while before she'd ended up on that mountainside. He noticed the right sleeve of her dress. It came all the way down to the wrist, and was buttoned tight there even in this heat. The left sleeve was pushed up to the elbow, the way you'd naturally push up sleeves when you were hot. "I need to check if you're injured anywhere," he said. Her eyes opened all the way for the first time. They were dark brown, and they fixed on him with an intensity that didn't match the rest of her condition, quick, sharp, assessing him the way you'd assess a threat. "I'm not injured," she said. "You were unconscious on a mountainside." "Heat. I ran out of water this morning." She pulled herself up slightly against the pillow. "I'm not injured." He almost let it go. He almost did. "Your right arm," he said quietly. Something happened in her face. Something fast and immediately controlled, but he caught it. The way a door swings open 1 inch and then gets shoved shut again. "What about it?" Her voice had gone flat. "You've got it buttoned to the wrist in July. It's 90 degrees. I burn easily." Ethan looked at her. She looked back at him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "All right," he said. And he pulled the chair from the table and sat down across the room from her, giving her the space she'd made very clear she wanted. "I'm not going to push you on anything. You're welcome to stay here until you're on your feet. I've got food, I've got water. I'm not going to ask you questions you don't want to answer." She studied him like she was waiting for the catch. "Why?" she said finally. "Why what? Why would you do that? For a stranger?" He looked at his hands. "Somebody did it for me once, when I didn't deserve it near as much as you probably do." She was quiet for a long time after that. "Abigail Morgan," she said at last. Her voice was carefully neutral, like she was handing him the name and waiting to see what he did with it. "Miss Morgan," he said, and touched 2 fingers to the brim of his hat the way his father had taught him. "You try to get some rest. I'll have something hot on the fire by evening." He got up and went outside to tend to Ranger, and he didn't look back. He didn't let himself wonder what she was covering up under that buttoned sleeve. He'd told her he wouldn't push, and Ethan Walker had made a life out of meaning what he said. but the image of her face, that half-second of raw terror when he'd mentioned her arm, stayed with him the rest of the afternoon, like a stone he couldn't shake from his boot. She was sitting up when he came back in at dusk, and she'd unpinned what was left of her hair and done something to make it tidy again. She'd smoothed out her dress. She had the leather bag in her lap, both hands resting on it. "I'm sorry," she said, "for being difficult." "You weren't difficult." He set a bowl of broth on the table. Simple stuff. He'd had dried venison and some onion and a few carrots from the small garden behind the cabin. Not much, but hot and real. "Come eat something." She moved carefully to the table, and he noticed how she favored her right side slightly when she stood. Not a limp. Something in the way she held herself, like there was a place that hurt when she moved her arm a certain way. He didn't say anything. She sat down and wrapped her hands around the bowl and lowered her head over the steam. And for a moment, her face did something soft and private that she probably didn't know he could see, like someone who had forgotten what it felt like to be warm. "When did you last eat?" he asked. "Yesterday morning." He pushed the bread toward her. She broke off a piece without being told twice. They ate in silence, which was fine with Ethan. He'd spent 4 years on this mountain in near total silence, and he'd stopped finding it uncomfortable. He let the quiet sit there between them like a third presence at the table, and he watched the tension in her shoulders very gradually not disappear, but settle. Like a horse that has been running hard and finally let itself slow to a walk. "You said you have a place about a mile up the ridge," she said eventually. "You live up here alone." "I do." "For how long?" 4 years, coming up on 5. She looked around the cabin. He'd watched her doing it since she'd sat up cataloging the place, the exits, the distances. He recognized that kind of looking. He'd done it himself once in the year after his brother died, when every room he walked into felt like something bad might be about to happen in it. "It's quiet," she said. It wasn't a complaint. "Yes." "Do people come up here often?" He looked at her. "No," he said. "The trail's not on any regular route. Men from the valley come through maybe twice a year if they're running stock up to summer pasture. A trapper sometimes in the fall." He paused. "Nobody comes up here who isn't looking for this specific place." She absorbed that. He watched her process it. "And nobody would know I was here," she said. "Not unless you told them, or I did." "Would you?" The question was direct, almost blunt, but there was nothing aggressive in it. It was the kind of question someone asked when they were calculating whether they could afford to close their eyes. "Miss Morgan," he said, "I don't make a habit of talking about my business to men from town. I've got even less interest in talking about yours." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked back down at her bowl. "The broth is good," she said quietly. "Thank you." He gave her the bed and took his usual place on the pallet near the fireplace, and he lay in the dark, listening to the mountain sounds outside, the insects, the wind moving through the pines, high up on the ridge, the distant call of some night bird. And he thought about the buttoned sleeve. Not because he was going to do anything about it. He wasn't. He'd meant what he said. He thought about it because he recognized the thing behind her eyes when he'd mentioned it. He'd seen that specific fear before, not in a stranger, in a mirror. It was the look of someone carrying something they didn't know how to put down. Something that had been with them so long, it had started to feel like part of their body rather than a thing that had been done to them. He'd worn that look for 2 years after Rebecca died, after he'd realized the accident hadn't been an accident at all, and that the people responsible were men with influence and lawyers, and the particular kind of moral certainty that came from never having been held accountable for anything. He'd put the look away eventually. He'd come to the mountain and worked it out of himself hour by hour, day by day, until it was buried deep enough that it only surfaced in bad weather and the anniversaries of things he tried not to count. He didn't know what Abigail Morgan was carrying, but he knew the weight of it because he'd carried something like it himself. She was already up when he woke at first light, sitting at the table with her hands wrapped around a cup of water, watching the pale square of the east window. She'd put her boots on the broken-heeled ones, and for a moment he thought she was going to thank him and leave. "I'd like to stay a few more days," she said. "If that's all right." "It's all right. I'll work for my keep. I can cook. I can help with whatever needs doing." "You don't have to earn your place here, Miss Morgan. I want to." She said it firmly, not like an offer, like a statement of intent. "I'm not accustomed to taking charity." He respected that. He understood it too, that particular pride that could almost break you, but was also the thing that held you together when everything else had gone loose. "All right," he said. "I could use help in the garden, and the woodbox needs filling." She nodded one quick, business-like dip of her chin. "And you'll need different boots," he said. "I've got a pair of my wife's—" He stopped. She looked at him. He hadn't said those words in 4 years. My wife's. They sat strange in the air of the cabin. "They'd be too big," he said finally. "But we can stuff the toes with cloth. Better than what you've got." She looked down at her ruined boots. "Your wife," she said carefully. "She doesn't live here anymore." "No," he said. "She doesn't." He went to get the boots from the trunk at the foot of the bed, and she didn't ask anything further, and he was grateful for that. She understood without being told that there were doors in this cabin that stayed closed. Maybe because she had a few of her own. The first 3 days settled into a rhythm that surprised him. She was up before him each morning, which he hadn't expected. She'd have water heating on the fire by the time he came in from checking on the horses, and she'd learned where he kept things quickly and moved around the kitchen end of the cabin without asking unnecessary questions. She cooked better than he did, which he noticed and didn't comment on, but which she clearly noticed him noticing. Because by the third morning, there was something that might have been a small, private satisfaction in the corner of her mouth when she set a plate in front of him. She worked hard in his garden. He watched her from the fence line one afternoon while she was bent over the row of carrots, pulling weeds with her left hand. Always her left hand, always with her right arm, held somewhat away from her body, the sleeve still buttoned tight at the wrist, even in the full heat of the afternoon sun. He turned away before she could catch him looking. In the evening she read. He had a small collection of books on a shelf above the fireplace. Things he'd accumulated over the years, whatever came through the town's small dry goods store that he could get for trade. She worked through them methodically one at a time, and sometimes he'd look up from sharpening a blade or mending tack to find her completely still, just reading the firelight on the side of her face. He'd forgotten what it looked like to have a person in the cabin in the evenings. He found he didn't mind it. On the fourth evening, she told him a piece of it. Not the whole thing. Not even close to the whole thing. But a piece. They were sitting by the fire after supper. She'd taken to sitting in the chair across from him, rather than at the table, and he'd moved his own chair slightly without really deciding to, so they weren't quite facing each other, but could talk without either of them having to turn. And he was working on a broken length of bridle, and she was reading, and she said without looking up from the page, "I was a school teacher in Callow Creek. Do you know it?" "I know of it," he said. "Never been. Down in the valley east side." "Yes." She turned a page. "I taught there for 2 years." He waited. "There was a man," she said. "A prominent man. The kind of man a town is built around." She said it without emotion, like she was reading a passage from a document. "He decided he wanted something from me. I told him no. He didn't particularly care for that answer." Ethan didn't say anything. He kept his hands moving on the leather. "He made certain things about me became known," she said. "Things that weren't true. Or things that were arrangements of true things, which can be worse." A pause. "I lost my position. My rooms. My reputation." She finally looked up from the book, though she looked at the fire rather than at him. "I had nowhere left to go that he didn't have a longer reach than I did. So I went somewhere he'd have less reason to follow." "A mountain nobody uses," Ethan said. "A mountain nobody uses." Something crossed her face. "I didn't plan for running out of water." "Plan rarely survives the first day," he said. She looked at him then, and something in her expression shifted. A fraction of the armor moved just slightly. "That's true," she said. He set down the bridle. "This man," he said. "He's still looking for you." Her jaw tightened. "I don't know. I don't think he's the kind of man who stops looking." She looked back at the fire. "But I think he's the kind of man who would stop if he thought there was nothing left to find." Ethan nodded slowly. He understood what she was saying and what she was not saying. "You're safe here," he said, "like I told you." She looked at him for a long moment. "You keep saying that," she said. "I keep meaning it." She held his gaze for 2-3 seconds longer than she'd held it before. Then she looked back at her book. "Good night, Mr. Walker," she said. "Good night, Miss Morgan." He took the bridle back up and kept working, and the fire crackled and the mountain made its nighttime sounds outside, and he told himself he wasn't thinking about the rest of the story, the part she hadn't told him. The part that had something to do with a right sleeve buttoned to the wrist in 90-degree heat. He told himself that for a good while. He didn't entirely believe himself. It was on the 6th day that it happened. He hadn't planned for it. He didn't think she had either. She'd been helping him with the horses in the late afternoon. He'd been teaching her in a casual way how to approach Ranger without spooking him, how to hold her hand flat for the sugar cube, how to let the horse learn her smell. She was quick to learn and careful, and Ranger had taken to her faster than Ethan would have predicted, which said something. Ranger was not an easy judge. She reached up to put her hand on the horse's neck, stretching her arm up and forward, and the motion pulled the right sleeve taut against her forearm, and the button at the wrist strained and slipped, and the cuff fell open about 2 inches. She yanked it closed immediately, yanked it hard, and took a step back from the horse, and pressed her arm against her side. But Ethan had been standing at the right angle, and the light had been right, and he'd seen it. Not clearly. Just a glimpse. Just enough. Old scarring. Layered. Not from one injury. He kept his face very still. He did not look at her arm. He looked at Ranger and made a small sound in the back of his throat and kept his hand on the horse's neck. She was breathing fast. He could hear it. "Ranger's got a lot of trust in him," Ethan said like nothing had happened. "Once he's decided on a person, he's decided. He won't give you trouble." He stroked the horse's neck. "Hand me that curry comb, would you?" A pause. He heard her breathe out. She handed him the curry comb. They finished with the horse in near silence, but it was a different kind of silence than it had been before. There was something in it now, a fragile held thing like a bird that had landed in your hand, and you were afraid to move for fear of startling it away. When they walked back toward the cabin, she said, "You saw." It wasn't a question. He didn't pretend it was. "Yes," he said. She stopped walking. He stopped too and turned to face her. Her chin was up. Her eyes were dry, but they had that quality to them, that glassiness, that meant they were staying dry on purpose. Her right hand had come up and was holding the cuff of her sleeve, gripping it tight. "Don't," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "Please, don't ask me." Ethan looked at her. He looked at this woman standing in the last of the afternoon sun on his mountain, holding her sleeve like she was the only thing keeping herself from flying apart. And he thought about 4 years of silence and a wife's boots in a trunk, and the particular loneliness of carrying something too heavy to put down. "I won't ask you anything, Miss Morgan," he said quietly. "I told you that. I meant it." She stared at him. "But I want you to know," he said, "that whatever is under that sleeve, whatever happened to you, it doesn't change a single thing about the fact that you are welcome here. For as long as you need." Her chin was still up, but her grip on her sleeve loosened just slightly. "You can't know that," she said. "You don't know what it is." "No," he said. "I don't. And it doesn't matter, doesn't." She looked away from him, then out across the slope, toward where the last of the light was painting the peaks gold and pink. Her throat moved. "People always say that," she said softly, "before they know." "I'm not people," he said. "I'm Ethan Walker, and I've learned the hard way that what a person has survived doesn't tell you who they are. It tells you how strong they had to become." She didn't answer. She stood there for the moment longer in the cooling evening air, and then she walked past him toward the cabin, and he let her go without another word. But as she opened the cabin door and the light from inside caught her, he saw something. The hand on her sleeve. It had unclenched. It was hanging loose at her side. Just for a moment. Just one moment. But he'd seen it. That night he lay on his pallet a long time before sleep came, and he didn't think about the scarring, or what it meant, or who had done it, or how. He thought about what she'd said. People always say that, before they know. He thought about the number of people who had stood in front of Abigail Morgan and made a version of that promise, and then taken it back when it cost them something. And he thought quietly, without drama, in the plain way he thought about most things that mattered to him, that he had no intention of being one of them. He closed his eyes. Outside, the mountain breathed around the cabin, cool, now that the sun was down the pines, moving against each other in the high dark. Ranger shifted in the lean-to. The fire ticked as it settled. Ethan Walker had come to this mountain to be done with the world. He was beginning to wonder if the world had other ideas. She didn't speak to him the next morning. Not one word. Not even when he set a cup of coffee in front of her and sat down across the table and gave her every reasonable opening a man could give without making it obvious he was giving her openings. She sat with her hands around the cup and her eyes somewhere past the window and her jaw set in a way that said she was working something through, and he left her to it. He knew that look. He'd worn it himself after the first person he'd ever told about Rebecca, about what had really happened, had sat across from him and said, "That's terrible." "Ethan, truly. But are you sure you're remembering it right?" He'd spent about 2 weeks after that, not trusting his own voice to say anything that mattered to anyone. So he ate his breakfast, and he didn't push, and when he got up to go tend the horses, she was still sitting there, and he just said, "I'll be out back if you need anything," and left it at that. He was halfway through the morning's work when he heard the cabin door. She came across the yard with her sleeves still buttoned, both of them, but she was carrying 2 cups, and she held one out to him, without looking at him directly. "You left yours on the table," she said. He took it. "Thank you." She stood there for a moment watching Ranger nose along the fence rail. Then she said, "I don't talk about it. I need you to understand that. Not because I don't want to, because I've learned what happens when I do." "All right," he said. "I'm not saying never." She finally looked at him, and her eyes were steady and direct and a little bit exhausted. "I'm saying not yet." "That's fair, Miss Morgan." "Abby," she said. "If I'm going to be staying here, you might as well call me Abby." He looked at her. "Ethan," he said. She nodded once, the same businesslike nod she'd been giving him since the first morning. But something in her face had gone fractionally softer, like a fist that had unclenched one finger. She turned and walked back toward the cabin, and he watched her go, and thought that a woman who had been through what he suspected she'd been through and still had the spine to walk across a yard and hand a man his coffee cup was something worth paying attention to. He drank the coffee. It was better than how he made it. He didn't say so out loud, but he thought she probably knew. Yum. The second week was different from the first. Not dramatically different. Not in any way he could have put precise words to if someone had asked. But the texture of the days changed in small, specific ways that he noticed, because he'd been alone long enough to notice everything. She started talking during meals. Not about herself, not about anything that mattered yet, but about small things. The garden, the horses, a book she'd been reading. She had opinions about things, real opinions that she'd say straight out, without softening them into questions first, which he respected because he'd known too many people who turned every thought into a question as a way of keeping a door open to retreat through if someone pushed back. She didn't do that. She said what she thought, and then she looked at him, and if he disagreed, she'd hear his reasoning out before deciding whether to revise her position. She revised it sometimes. She didn't other times. And she always had a reason either way. He found himself talking more than he had in years. It happened gradually enough that he didn't notice it. At first didn't notice that the silences had gotten shorter and the sentences longer, that he was saying things over dinner he hadn't said to another person in 4 years. Things about the horses, about how the upper pasture ran dry in August if they didn't get rain in July, and how his father had taught him to read the color of the grass, to know how much water was sitting in the ground below. Things he'd stored up without knowing he was storing them. Things he'd thought and observed and had nobody to say out loud to. She listened. Properly listened, the way people who'd spent time in front of a classroom learned to do, watching his face, asking the right questions, remembering things he'd said 3 days ago, and connecting them to what he was saying now. On a Thursday afternoon, toward the end of the second week, she rode Ranger for the first time. Ethan had been working her up to it slowly, just the brushing, then the saddling, then leading him around the yard on the lead rope. She'd been patient about it, which surprised him because she struck him as the kind of person who generally pushed themselves past ready. But she'd taken her time with Ranger, let the horse set the pace of the thing, and by that Thursday the horse leaned into her hand when she approached the fence rather than just tolerating her. He helped her into the saddle and stepped back. Ranger stood quiet. She sat there for a moment, hands loose on the reins, getting used to the height of it. Then she looked down at Ethan. "Now what?" she said. "Press your left heel in, very lightly." She did. Ranger moved off in a slow walk along the fence line. She didn't grab for the saddle horn. She didn't tense up and throw her weight back. She moved with him, finding the rhythm of it in about 30 seconds flat, like her body understood things her mind hadn't been told yet. Ethan watched her ride his horse around the yard and felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't known was tight. When she pulled Ranger back around to the fence, she was breathing a little fast, and her cheeks were flushed, and she looked for just that moment, like something had been scrubbed clean off of her, like she'd left something behind in that circuit around the yard, and come back without it. "Again," he said. "Again," she said. That evening she cooked venison stew with the dried herbs from the bundle hanging above the fireplace, and it was better than anything Ethan had produced in the last year, and she knew it, and he knew she knew it, and he told her so, which made her press her lips together to keep from smiling. "My mother was a very good cook," she said. "She believed it was the most important thing a woman could know. She spent half my childhood trying to teach me, and I spent half my childhood arguing that reading was more useful." She pushed a piece of carrot around the bowl. "I eventually conceded the point." "You gave up arguing with her." "I gave up pretending I hadn't been paying attention the whole time." Something moved across her face. "She died when I was 17. After that I was glad I'd watched her, glad I'd remembered." He didn't offer condolences. He'd had enough condolences offered to him to know they mostly served the person saying them more than the person hearing them. He just said, "She taught you well." Abby looked up at him. "Your wife," she said carefully, the way she'd learned to say anything that pointed in the direction of that territory. "Was she a good cook?" "She was a terrible cook," he said. "Burned everything. The woman had no instinct for fire at all." Something in Abby's expression gentled. "But you liked her cooking anyway." "I ate everything she made," he said, and never said a word about it. "And she knew I was lying, and we never talked about that either." He paused. "Marriage is mostly a negotiation about what you don't say." Abby was quiet for a moment. "That sounds like a kind marriage," she said. "It was," he said, "while it lasted." She didn't push further. She went back to her stew. But later, when he was banking the fire for the night and she'd gone to the bed with her book, he heard her say quietly, without looking up from the page, "Thank you, Ethan, for telling me that." He didn't answer, but he thought she understood that silence as well as she understood the words. On the 15th day, she dropped a jar. It was the canning jar he kept nails in a big heavy thing, and she was reaching for something on the shelf above it, and her elbow caught it, and it went off the shelf, and she grabbed for it with her right arm reflex. Pure reflex, and the twist of the motion made her pull up sharp and go white in the face. The jar hit the floor and cracked open, and nails scattered everywhere. She stood very still with her right arm pulled against her chest, breathing deliberately through her nose. "Abby?" "I'm fine." Her voice was controlled, too controlled. "You're not fine." He crossed the room. "Let me see." "I said, I'm Abby." He said it quietly. Not an order. A request. He stopped a foot away from her, and he looked at her face, white around the mouth, jaw locked, and he said, "I'm not asking you to tell me anything. I'm asking you to let me see if something's torn." She stared at him. He waited. "It pulls sometimes," she said finally, "when I move wrong." "I know," he said. "That's what old damage does." Something in his voice made her look at him differently. Not like she was assessing a threat anymore, like she was reassessing something she'd already assessed and gotten wrong. She held her arm out to him. He reached forward and took her wrist in his hand gently and undid the button at the cuff. He kept his face very still. He'd told himself he would, and he did, but it took real effort. The scarring ran from wrist to mid-forearm on the inside, layered. Some old faded to silver, some less old. Not from a single injury or an accident. He knew what accidental scarring looked like. He'd seen enough of it on working ranches. This was not that. He examined the arm with his hands, the joint, the muscle beneath the skin, and found what he was looking for. A stiffness in the tissue on the outer edge, the kind that meant a deeper injury improperly healed. "Nothing new's torn," he said. "But there's old damage in the muscle that never set right. Does it ache when the weather changes?" She looked at him like she was deciding something. "Yes," she said. "I can wrap it. It'll help with the pulling." He didn't release her wrist. He didn't button the cuff back up. He just held her arm carefully in both hands and looked at her and said, "I'm going to say one thing only, and then I'm done with it." She waited. "Whatever happened to you," he said, "was not your fault. And whoever did this to you—" He stopped. His jaw worked for a moment. "Should answer for it." Her chin came up. Her eyes were glass clear and dry and enormous. "He won't," she said. "Men like him never do." "Maybe not," Ethan said, "but that doesn't make it your fault." She looked at him for a long time. Long enough that he could see the thing moving in her face, not breaking through, not yet, but pressing from the inside. She swallowed it down. She was very good at swallowing things down. "Wrap it," she said quietly. "Please." He got the cloth from the medicine box and wrapped her forearm with the same hands he used for injured horses, firm, careful, without false gentleness. She watched his face the whole time. He let her. When he finished, he set her arm down and stepped back, and she looked at the wrapping and flexed her hand once, testing it. "Better," he said. "Better," she said. She buttoned her cuff back up over the wrapping, and he picked up the cracked jar and the scattered nails, and neither of them said another word about it. But when he looked up from the floor, she was watching him with something in her expression he hadn't seen on her face before. Something quieter and less defended than anything she'd shown him yet. He looked back down at the nails. He didn't want her to feel watched right now. She deserved to have that look on her face without an audience. "Yesterday." 3 days later, she told him the man's name. She said it the way you say the name of a thing you've been carrying in the dark for a long time, carefully, like putting it down, like testing whether the floor would hold its weight outside your own body. "Harlan Goss," she said. They were sitting outside in the evening on the bench Ethan had built against the south wall of the cabin, where the warmth of the day stored up in the wood, and the logs after the sun went down. She had her knees angled away from him. He had his elbows on his thighs, hands loose between them. "He owns most of Callow Creek," she said. "The bank. 3 of the 4 largest properties. Half the men on the town council owe him money." She paused. "The other half are afraid of him." Ethan said nothing. "I had a student," she said. "A girl, 12 years old, Clara Briggs. She came to school one Monday with a bruise on her arm that went from elbow to shoulder." She stopped. "Her father worked for Harlan Goss." The air between them went very quiet. "I went to the sheriff," she said. "The sheriff went to Goss, and Goss came to me." Her voice stayed even carefully, even the way a person's voice gets when they've told themselves a story so many times they've learned to tell it without shaking. "He told me that if I repeated what I'd said to the sheriff to anyone else, he would make sure the whole town knew about things from my past that weren't true, and some things that were, but weren't what he'd make them sound like." "Did you repeat it?" Ethan said. "To the circuit judge," she said, "when he came through in April." Ethan looked at her. "The judge was also in Goss's debt," she said flatly. "As it turned out." He let out a slow breath through his nose. "3 days after I went to the judge," she said, "the story was everywhere. About me. All of it exactly what Goss had promised, plus things he'd added for color." She pressed her lips together. "I was let go from the school. My rooms were taken. 2 women I'd considered friends crossed the street to avoid me." She paused. "I had $40 and no references and no family left to go back to." "So you ran," he said. "I ran," she said. "Not ashamed, not defensive, just truthful. I'm not proud of it, but I was afraid of what I might do if I stayed." He looked at her sideways. "What does that mean?" She turned to look at him directly, and in the evening light her eyes were very dark and very serious. "It means I was angrier than I was afraid," she said. "And that frightened me more than Goss did." He held her gaze. "Good," he said. She blinked. "Good. Anger means you know what happened was wrong." He looked back out at the dark. "Fear makes you run. Anger makes you come back." She was quiet for a long moment. "You sound like you're speaking from experience," she said. "I am." She waited, and this time he was the one deciding how much to say, how much of it to put down on the floor between them and see if it held. "My wife died 4 years ago," he said. "Rebecca. She was thrown from a horse on the Callow Creek Road." He paused. "Except she wasn't. She was run off it. By a man who owed a debt to a man who wanted our land. And the sheriff who investigated it was the same sheriff who'd been looking the other way for the man who owed the debt." Abby had gone very still. "I had evidence," he said. "I went to 3 different men with authority and money and law behind them. Each one of them found reasons why my evidence wasn't sufficient." He turned to look at her. "I understand something about men like Harlan Goss. Men who've built their whole world out of other people's silence." She looked at him for a long time without speaking. "What did you do?" she said at last. "With your anger." "I built a fence," he said. "Then another. Then I built this cabin and 40 other things. I worked until I couldn't think anymore." He paused. "And then I stopped working, and I thought about it anyway. And now—" He was quiet for a moment. "Now I'm on a mountain," he said. "And I've got a woman sitting next to me who's angrier than she is afraid, and I think that's the right way around to be." She looked down at her hands in her lap. "Clara," she said softly. "The girl. I left her there." "You're not gone yet," he said. She looked up at him sharply. He met her eyes. "You're on a mountain, not in the ground." He said it plainly without drama. "There's still time." Her jaw was tight, and her eyes were bright with something she was holding back, and she nodded once, just once, and then she looked back out at the dark, and they sat there together in the stored warmth of the cabin wall until the stars came all the way out. She started sleeping longer in the mornings, not in a hollow way, not the sleep of someone retreating in the way of someone whose body was finally deciding it was allowed to rest. He could hear it in the change of her breathing through the mornings when he rose early and moved around the cabin quietly, and he took it as a good sign and didn't disturb her. She'd taken over the garden almost entirely by the 3rd week, which he hadn't planned but didn't argue with. She had a feel for it. She'd gotten the carrot row producing better than he'd managed in 2 seasons, and she'd identified 3 plants he'd been treating as weeds that she informed him were edible and useful, and she said it in a way that let him know she thought his failure to know this was a reasonable gap in his education. He agreed that it probably was. She'd started teaching him things. He noticed this, the slow reversal of it, the way the instruction had moved from him to her, without either of them making a decision about it. He'd started asking her questions about the plants, and she'd started answering them in that particular way she must have answered questions in a classroom, with patience and with the assumption that the person asking genuinely wanted to know. He did genuinely want to know. One afternoon, he came in from the fence line and found her at the table with a piece of paper and a pen he hadn't known he owned. "You write," he said. "I used to." She set the pen down. "I was writing down what I remember, while it's still clear." She folded the paper before he could see what was on it. About Clara's arm, what it looked like, the date, what I reported to the sheriff and what he said in return. She looked at him steadily. "I may need a record." He stared at her. "You're thinking about going back." "I'm thinking about not running anymore," she said. "Those aren't entirely the same thing." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He looked at the folded paper and at her face and thought about what it had cost her to write whatever was on it. To pull that out of the place she'd put it and put it on paper where it couldn't be taken back. "Goss still has all the influence," he said. "The bank, the council." "I know. The sheriff's in his pocket." "I know that too." "So what changes?" he said. "If you go back, what changes?" She looked at him steadily. "I do," she said. "I went before because I thought the law would protect me. I was wrong about that." She put her hand flat on the folded paper. "But there's a territorial circuit court. I've been thinking about it. The judge who came through Callow Creek Goss owns him, but he doesn't own all of them. And if I had enough written down, enough documented, enough people willing to—" She stopped. "I know it's a long chance." "It is," he said, "but it's a chance." She met his eyes. "And I'm done deciding that no chance is better than a bad one." He looked at her across the table. This woman who'd been lying unconscious on a mountainside a month ago, who'd woken up grabbing her bag and begging a stranger not to look at her arm, who'd spent 2 weeks watching him like she was waiting for the moment he'd prove himself the same as every other man she'd met. She wasn't looking at him that way anymore. She was looking at him like someone who'd made a decision and wanted to know if he was going to be part of it. "You'll need witnesses," he said. "People in town who saw things, who aren't afraid of Goss or can be given reason not to be." "I have 2 names," she said. "Women who knew Clara, who've known other things about Goss over the years that they never said because there was no one to say it to." "It's not enough," he said. "I know. But it's a start," he said. She let out a breath. "Yes." He leaned back in the chair and looked at the ceiling and thought about it for a minute, the way he thought about serious things slowly and from more than one direction. "I know a man," he said finally. "A federal land agent. He was the one honest person I found when I was working through what happened to Rebecca. He couldn't do anything for me at the time. The evidence I had wasn't in his jurisdiction. But he gave me his word he'd listen if I ever came back with something he could use." He paused. "Land fraud is in his jurisdiction. If Goss is using the bank to force people off their property." "He is?" Abby said. It came out fast and certain. "3 families I know of. The Hendersons, Old Man Pruitt, a widow named Castillo who had 40 acres east of town." Ethan looked at her. "You've been keeping track." "I'm a school teacher," she said. "Keeping track is what I do." Something moved in his chest, not a small thing, not a thing he could have named without feeling embarrassed about it. He looked back at the ceiling. "His name is Aldous Webb," he said. "Federal agent out of Helena. If what you've got on paper, plus what those women know, plus the land fraud adds up to what I think it might—" He stopped. "It's still a long chance." "I know," she said. "And Goss will know you went to someone the minute you make contact. He'll move to protect himself." "I know that too." "You'd need to be somewhere safe while it unfolds, somewhere he can't reach you." She looked at him across the table. He looked at her. "I know a mountain," she said softly. He held her gaze for a moment. Then something at the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but close to one, the kind of expression a man makes when he's decided to stop fighting something. "Then it's a plan," he said. She picked up the pen. She unfolded the paper. She smoothed it out on the table, and she kept writing. He got up and made coffee, and didn't say anything else, and the only sounds in the cabin were the pen scratching across the paper, and the fire and the mountains settling around them in the late afternoon heat. That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay on the pallet, and he stared at the ceiling, and he listened to her breathing across the room, the slow, even breathing of someone genuinely asleep, and he thought about Rebecca. Not the way he usually thought about her, which was with the specific, contained grief he'd built a whole private architecture around. He thought about her differently tonight. He thought about what she'd been like when she was angry, when something was wrong and she'd decided to stop being polite about it. She'd had a quality about her, then a quality he could only describe as becoming more herself, becoming more solidly present in the room. Abby had that quality. He hadn't let himself notice it head-on before. He'd been noticing it sideways, the way you look at something bright from the corner of your eye, never directly. Tonight he let himself notice it directly. She'd come to this mountain running. That was still true. But the woman sitting across from him this afternoon with a pen in her hand and a plan in her eyes was not a woman running anymore. She'd stopped somewhere in the last 3 weeks between the writing lessons and the evening conversations, and the careful business of learning to trust, and she'd turned around. He didn't know exactly when it had happened. He knew it had something to do with him. That was the part he lay awake thinking about. Not with Hope, he was too careful. For Hope had spent too many years building walls against exactly that kind of soft thinking. But with the quiet, unavoidable acknowledgement of a man who prides himself on being honest about what he observes. He observed that Abigail Morgan had turned this cabin from a place he endured into a place he looked forward to coming back to. He observed that he hadn't thought about leaving the mountain in 3 weeks, hadn't felt the usual restless pull of the wrong season, the bad anniversary, the walls closing in. He observed that when she laughed, really laughed, which she'd done twice now, both times at something he'd said without meaning to be funny, it did something to the quality of the air in the room. He was not going to do anything about any of these observations. That was also something he observed clearly lying there in the dark, and it didn't trouble him. She was not here for this. She was here to become herself again, to put down what she'd been carrying long enough to pick up something worth carrying instead. He was not going to be the thing that complicated that. But he lay awake another hour anyway, and across the room in the dark, she made a small sound in her sleep. Not distress, not a nightmare, just a small, quiet, settling sound, like someone finding a more comfortable place to be. And Ethan Walker closed his eyes and let that be enough. The letter went out on a Tuesday. Ethan rode down to the valley himself alone before first light while Abby was still sleeping. He'd told her the night before that he was going to check on a fence line on the lower pasture and might be gone until midday. She'd nodded and said she'd have something ready when he got back, and she hadn't asked questions, which meant she either trusted him or had learned that some things moved better when you didn't put too many words around them. He suspected both. He left the letter with the postmaster in Ridgefield, the town 12 miles west of Callow Creek, that had no particular connection to Harlan Goss as far as Ethan knew. He'd addressed it to Aldous Webb Federal Land Office, Helena, Montana Territory, and he'd written it himself in his plain, undecorated hand, on the back of 2 pages torn from the ledger book he used to track winter supplies. He'd written what Abby had told him, the names of the families, the banknotes, the dates of foreclosure, Clara Briggs and her father, and what Abby had reported, and what the sheriff had said in return. He'd signed it with his own name and his own land coordinates and the date. Then he'd ridden back up the mountain with the particular feeling in his chest that he associated with decisions that couldn't be undone. Not regret. Something more like the sensation of having committed your weight to a step before you knew for certain the ice would hold. He told Abby what he'd done when he got back. She was in the garden. She stood up straight and looked at him for a long moment, and he watched the thing move across her face. Not surprise, not fear, something more complicated than either of those. "You signed it," she said. "Yes." With your name. That's what signing means. She pulled off her gardening gloves and held them in both hands and looked at him in a way that made him feel like she was measuring something. Goss will know your name, she said. If Webb passes it along. If anyone talks. Let him know it, Ethan said. Ethan? I've been on this mountain 4 years, Abby, keeping my head down, minding my own. He looked at her steadily. Minding your own is just another way of leaving other people to manage the weight alone. I'm done with that. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she looked down at the gloves in her hands. Thank you, she said quietly. Don't thank me yet, he said. Webb might not come, or he might come and decide it's not enough. Or Goss might find out before Webb can do anything useful. All three of those things might happen, she agreed. She looked up. But they might not. No, he said. They might not. She put her gloves back on and went back to the garden, and he went to tend the horses, and the mountain went on around them the way it always did, indifferent and enormous, and neither of them talked about it again that day. But that night, sitting across the fire from each other, she read aloud to him from the book she'd been working through, something she'd never done before, always read silently while he worked, and he listened to her voice fill up the cabin and didn't say a word about it, just let it settle over the evening, like something that had been missing and had now come back. 2 weeks went by. Then on the first day of the 4th week after the letter, Ranger started throwing his head in the yard, and Ethan looked up from the hitching rail and saw the rider coming down from the upper trail. Single horse, single rider. Moving at a moderate pace, no hurry, no carefulness, either the pace of someone who knew where he was going and wasn't worried about being followed. Ethan stepped inside. We've got a rider coming. Abby was at the table. She was up and beside the window in one motion, and she looked out and was quiet for a moment, reading the approaching figure. One man, she said. One man, he confirmed. Goss's people move in pairs. Minimum. She stepped back from the window. It might be Webb. Or it might be nobody with sense enough to bring company, Ethan said. He took the rifle from above the door and leaned it against the wall next to him. Stay inside until I know who it is. She didn't argue. She moved to the side of the window where she could see out without being seen. The rider came into the yard and stopped and raised his hand palm forward. He was in his 50s, heavy set with a gray beard and a federal badge pinned to a leather vest. Aldous Webb, the man called. Looking for Ethan Walker. Ethan came out onto the step. You found him. Webb dismounted and tied his horse and walked forward and up close. He looked exactly the way Ethan remembered him, a man who appeared comfortable and unhurried because he'd trained himself into it. The kind of calm that came from 30 years of walking into situations where showing nerves got people hurt. Got your letter? Webb said. He stopped 10 feet away and looked at Ethan with steady gray eyes. Took me 2 weeks to run down the land records before I'd make the ride. You were right about the foreclosures. 3 of the 4 have irregularities in the bank documentation. He paused. The 4th one, the Castillo property, Goss filed that transfer under a different name. Almost missed it. Ethan felt the tightness in his chest loosen just slightly. Almost, he said. Almost. Webb agreed. He looked at the cabin. The woman you mentioned, Abigail Morgan. She here? Ethan glanced back at the door. Abby was already standing in it. She stepped out onto the step, and she looked at Webb with the same measuring quality she brought to everything, and Webb looked at her with the professional respect of a man who had learned to take people at their actual weight rather than the weight he expected. Miss Morgan, he said, and touched his hat. I've read what Walker wrote. I'd like to hear it from you directly if you're willing. I'm willing, she said. I've been waiting 6 months to say it to someone who might do something about it. They sat at the table for 3 hours. Abby talked, and Webb listened, and asked questions, and wrote things down in a small leather-covered book, and Ethan sat at the far end of the table and said nothing because this was hers to carry, and she was carrying it without any help from him. She told Webb everything. Not the version she'd told Ethan in pieces across evenings filtered through the careful management of a woman who'd learned to protect herself by controlling how much she gave at once. The full version. Clara Briggs and the bruise. The sheriff and what he'd said and what Goss had said after. The women who'd turned away from her on the street. The way the story about her had spread specific things she said, specific phrases that showed up in multiple mouths too quickly to be organic things that had been distributed deliberately by someone with reach. She said Harlan Goss's name without flinching clearly twice. Webb wrote it down. Then she said, "There's something else. Something I haven't told anyone." Ethan looked at her. She had her hands flat on the table. She was looking at Webb, not at Ethan, and her voice had gone to that careful, deliberate register she used when she was controlling something that wanted to come out differently. "The night before I left Callow Creek," she said, "a man came to the room I was still renting. One of Goss's men. He said Goss wanted me to understand that the story wasn't finished, that if I made any more trouble—" She stopped. "He grabbed my arm, my right arm, and he told me that the next time someone found me with injuries, there'd be nobody around to question how I'd gotten them." Webb's pen stopped moving. Ethan was very still. "That's a direct threat of violence," Webb said. "Yes," she said. "You have his name, the man who came to your room." "Dale Pruitt," she said. "He manages Goss's properties. He's been with Goss 11 years. Webb looked at her for a moment and then wrote the name down. Ethan looked at Abby's face, at the lines around her mouth that were there from holding that particular thing in check, and he thought about the night she'd woken up on his mountain, grabbing her bag, and he thought about the sleeve, and he thought about 2 months of her moving carefully, always carefully, as if the space around her was something that could break. He understood now why she'd run, and why she'd stayed running even when she'd had enough strength to do something else. She hadn't been afraid of Goss coming after her reputation again. She'd been afraid of what Pruitt's hands felt like on her arm. He kept his face still. He kept his hands still on the table. He breathed steadily through his nose. Webb was talking again, laying out what he had, what he thought he could do with it. He had the land records. He had the bank documentation. He had Abby's testimony on the intimidation of a witness and the direct threat. He had Ethan's letter and the name of the Callow Creek sheriff as a potential co-defendant. "It's enough to bring to a federal grand jury," Webb said. "Not enough to guarantee anything, but enough to open a case." He looked at Abby. "You'd have to testify, in person, in front of a federal judge." "I know," she said. "Goss will know within days that a case has been opened. He'll have lawyers. He'll come after your credibility." "He already did," she said. "He used every piece of my past he could find, and some things he invented. If that's the worst he has, I've already survived it." Webb looked at her steadily. "He might try something else, something less legal." "He might," she said. "But I have somewhere to be that he doesn't know about." She glanced at Ethan for just a moment. "And I have time to prepare." Webb nodded slowly. He closed his book. "I'll need 4 to 6 weeks to file the formal complaint and get a date before the judge." He looked at Ethan. "She's safe up here." "As safe as she'd be anywhere," Ethan said. "That'll have to do," Webb said. He stood and extended his hand to Abby first. "Miss Morgan, you've done something brave. I want you to know I understand what it costs." She shook his hand. Her grip was firm. After Webb rode back down the trail, she stood in the yard and watched him go, and then she stood there for another minute after he disappeared, very still, her arms at her sides. Ethan stood beside her. "You didn't tell me about Pruitt," he said, not accusingly, just as a fact. "No," she said. "Why?" She was quiet for a moment. "Because when I said his name out loud just now, I was afraid I'd come apart." She turned to look at him, and her eyes were dry, and her chin was steady, and her voice was absolutely level. "I couldn't afford to come apart in front of Webb. He needed to see me as a credible witness, not a frightened woman." "You're both," Ethan said. "I know that," she said. "But only one of them is useful today." He looked at her for a moment. "You're the strongest person I've met in a long time," he said. "And I spent 3 years in rooms with men who believed that about themselves." She looked at him, and something in her face shifted, not the armor dropping, something more than that. Something underneath the armor, something older and quieter and more true. "Don't," she said softly. "Don't what?" "Don't say things like that right now," she said. "I'm barely keeping it together." "I know," he said. "That's why I'm saying it." She looked away. Her throat moved. She nodded once, and then she went inside, and he gave her the cabin and took a long walk out to the upper fence line, and didn't come back until she'd had an hour alone with whatever she needed to work through. When he came back, she had supper on the fire, and she handed him a cup and didn't look up from the pot, and he sat down and didn't say anything. And the evening settled around them the way evenings had been settling around them for weeks now, with the particular quality of two people who had stopped performing ease and were actually feeling it. 10 days later, the men from Callow Creek found them. Ethan heard Ranger first. The horse had been quiet all morning, grazing easy on the south side of the lean-to, and then suddenly he wasn't quiet anymore. Ethan was inside showing Abby the land record copies Webb had left them, pointing out the specific irregularities in the Castillo filing, and Ranger's alarm sound came through the wall sharp and clear. He was on his feet before the sound finished. "Inside," he said. Abby didn't argue. She moved to the side of the door, and he saw her hand close around the fireplace poker on her way past it. Good, he thought. He took the rifle. He stepped out onto the step, and he didn't make himself small or step back into shadow. He stood right in the open where they could see him, because men who came to intimidate counted heavily on the other person not wanting to be seen. 3 riders. Coming down the trail from the north, which meant they'd come around the long way around the back of the ridge, rather than up the main trail from the valley. That told him something. That told him they knew this land better than strangers should. He recognized one of them when they got close enough. Dale Pruitt. Ethan had never seen the man before, had no way of knowing his face, but he knew him anyway, recognized him in the way the man sat, his horse the confidence of someone who'd never in his life arrived somewhere and been told to leave. Heavy-set, clean-shaved, a dark coat despite the summer heat. The 2 men with him were younger, and watching Ethan with the careful attention of men who'd been told there might be trouble. They stopped 15 feet from the step. Pruitt looked at Ethan. Then, past Ethan at the cabin door. Then, back at Ethan. "Looking for a woman," Pruitt said. "Abigail Morgan. We have reason to believe she came this way." "Lot of people come this way," Ethan said. "Do they?" Pruitt looked around the yard the way you look at a thing you're considering purchasing. "Nice place. Awful remote, though. Man could get into trouble up here and take a long time to be found. Or he could find trouble was already here waiting," Ethan said pleasantly. Pruitt's eyes came back to him. "You got a name." "Walker." Something moved in Pruitt's face, not fear, not quite. A recalibration. He'd been given a name before he came then. He knew who Ethan was. "Mr. Walker," he said, "I don't have any business with you. The woman I'm looking for has some property that belongs to our employer. We'd like to return it to her." "That's very generous," Ethan said. "She's not here." "Mind if we check?" "I do, actually." The 2 younger men exchanged a look. Pruitt's jaw tightened just slightly. "Mr. Walker," he said, "you don't know who you're getting in between." "Harlan Goss," Ethan said. "Of Callow Creek. Owns the bank and most of the town council and a sheriff who does what he's told. You're Dale Pruitt. You manage his properties. You've been with him 11 years. He held Pruitt's gaze steadily. "I know exactly who I'm getting between. I made a considered decision." Pruitt stared at him. Then behind Ethan the cabin door opened. Abby stepped out. Ethan didn't turn. He heard her footsteps on the boards, felt her presence come up beside him, and he held his position and let her stand where she was going to stand. Pruitt's eyes moved to her, and something in them shifted. The professional blankness cracked just slightly, like a man who'd expected to find a mouse and found something else. "Miss Morgan," he said, and the pleasantness in his voice was a performance, and not a very good one. "Mr. Goss was concerned about you, wanted to make sure you were all right." "I'm sure he did," she said. Her voice was perfectly level. "He'd like you to come back to Callow Creek, sort out any misunderstandings." "There aren't any misunderstandings," she said. "We both understand each other very well." Pruitt looked at her and the performance dropped another inch. "You'd be making a mistake," he said. "Staying up here, filing complaints with people who can't help you. You'd be making a mistake that you won't have another chance to unmake." Ethan felt the thing move through him, not rage colder than that. The specific cold that came from hearing a threat delivered in the language of concern, the particular cruelty of a man who'd learned to make danger sound like advice. "Pruitt," he said, and waited until the man's eyes came back to him. "You made a mistake coming up this trail. I want you to understand that clearly before you make another one." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't adjust his posture. "I've written down your name. I've written down today's date and the time you arrived. I've written down what you said and what you implied. That document is not on this property." He paused. "If anything happens to Miss Morgan, if anything happens to me, that document goes somewhere that will not be good for Harlan Goss." Pruitt looked at him for a long moment. "You're bluffing," he said. "Maybe," Ethan said. "Or maybe 2 weeks ago a federal agent sat at my table for 3 hours and drank my coffee." He tilted his head slightly. "You want to find out which it is?" The silence on the yard stretched long and thin and taut. One of the younger riders shifted his horse, and Ethan's attention went to him for 1/2 of a second, and in that half second he heard Abby's voice clear and unshaking. "Dale Pruitt," she said, "I want to be very plain with you. I am not the woman you came to your room. I am not afraid of what happened to me 6 months ago. I am not going to run from it, and I am not going to be silent about it." She paused, just one beat, exactly the right length. "Tell Mr. Goss that what he did to Clara Briggs's father will be part of the federal record. Tell him the names of the families he forced off their land are already in a federal land agent's ledger. And tell him—" Her voice dropped just slightly, which made it more powerful rather than less. "Tell him that the woman he threatened in a back room in Callow Creek is done being threatened." Pruitt stared at her. She looked back at him with the stillness of someone who had decided fully and finally decided, and there was nothing in her face that any man with sense would want to push against. Pruitt pulled his horse around. He didn't say anything else. He didn't look back. The 2 younger men followed him, and in less than a minute, the sound of the horses was gone back up the north trail, and the yard was quiet again. Ethan let out one long, slow breath. Beside him, Abby was shaking. Barely a fine tremor in her hands and her shoulders, the kind that came after not during. He turned to look at her. "That was—" he started. "Don't," she said. Her voice was unsteady now. "Don't say anything yet. Give me a minute." He gave her a minute. She stood in the yard and breathed through it this woman who had stood up to the arm of a man who'd put his hands on her and threatened her life, and she breathed it through until the trembling settled. Then she looked at Ethan. "Was any of that true?" she said. "The document, not being on the property." "The part about Webb sitting at the table was true," he said. She looked at him. "And the rest?" "I wrote something down this morning," he said. "Before I heard Ranger, I left it in the saddlebag of the horse I keep at the Ridgefield livery." She stared at him. "You wrote it this morning?" "I've been watching the North Trail for a week," he said. "I reckon they'd come the back way if they came at all." She shook her head slowly. "You didn't tell me." "You had enough to carry." "Ethan." "You stood out here and said what you said," he said. "You didn't need to know about a piece of paper to do that. That came from you." She looked at him for a long moment. Then something broke loose in her face, not falling apart, not fear, something releasing. Something that had been held at enormous cost for a very long time, letting go of its own weight. She put her hand over her mouth. He took one step forward, and she stepped into him, and he put his arms around her, and she shook. Properly. Shook this time, all the fear and the fury and the 6 months of running, and he held on and didn't say a word. She wasn't crying, she was shaking. There's a difference, and he knew the difference, and he held her through it the same way he held Ranger through a bad storm, steady and present, and he kept his mouth shut. After a while, she stepped back. She pulled herself straight. "They'll go back to Goss," she said. Her voice was rough but clear. "He'll know Webb is involved now. He'll move faster." "Yes," Ethan said. "We need to contact Webb." "Yes. Today, I need to write another letter. Everything that just happened. Everything Pruitt said." "I've got paper inside," he said. She nodded. She was back. Whatever had broken loose had moved through her, and she was back on the other side of it, clear-eyed and already working. She turned toward the cabin. Then she stopped. She turned back and looked at him with an expression he hadn't seen on her face before. Not the measuring look, not the careful look, not the controlled look. Something direct and plain, and for the first time, entirely undefended. "I would have run," she said quietly. 6 months ago, if 3 men had ridden into a yard and said what he said, I would have run. She paused. "I didn't run." "No," he said. "You didn't. That's—" She stopped, tried again. "Something happened to me on this mountain, Ethan. Something I don't have the right words for yet." He looked at her across the yard, this woman with dust on her boots and her chin steady and the last of the summer light on her face. "You don't need words for it," he said. "You showed it." She held his gaze for one more moment. Then she went inside, and he heard the chair pull back from the table and the rustle of paper, and he stood in the yard for another minute in the quiet that Pruitt had left behind. It was a different kind of quiet now, not the quiet of a mountain that had been left alone. The quiet of a mountain that had been tested and held. He looked out at the trail where the 3 riders had gone, and he thought about Harlan Goss sitting in some well-appointed office in Callow Creek, waiting for Pruitt to come back with news that the problem had been managed. He thought about what it was going to feel like when Pruitt walked through that door. Then he went inside to help her write the letter. Webb's reply came in 9 days. Ethan rode to Ridgefield to get it himself, and he read it standing at the livery hitching rail before he rode back up, and when he read it, he stood very still for a moment. Then he rode home. Abby was waiting in the yard when he came in. She could read his face by now, he knew that, and she came off the bench where she'd been sitting and walked toward him without waiting for him to dismount. "Tell me," she said. He swung down from the saddle. "Grand jury," he said. "Webb filed the complaint 3 days ago. They've granted a date." He looked at her. 6 weeks. Federal courthouse in Helena. She stopped in front of him. "And Goss," she said. "Webb says Goss's lawyer filed a response within 48 hours. He paused. "Which means Goss knew about the federal complaint within 48 hours of Webb filing it." Her jaw tightened. "How?" "Someone in the federal land office," Ethan said. "Webb suspects it. He says to assume Goss knows everything we know and move accordingly." She was quiet for a moment, processing it. 6 weeks, she said. 6 weeks, he confirmed. "He'll try to discredit me before we get to Helena," she said. "He'll go after my witnesses, the 2 women in Callow Creek, if he finds out I've named them. Webb's sending someone to Callow Creek to take their statements formally," Ethan said. "Once they're in the federal record, Goss moving against them makes it worse for him, not better." She nodded slowly. "And Clara," she said. The girl's name, the way she said it, it still had the same weight it had carried when she'd said it the first time, months ago. Clara Briggs had been the reason for all of it. The reason Abby had walked into the sheriff's office instead of looking away. "Webb's looking into it," Ethan said. "The father worked for Goss. If Goss was using him to hide something, the girl's situation becomes part of the case." Something moved in Abby's face. Relief and something harder than relief. "She's still there," she said. "Still in that town." "I know." 6 weeks is a long time for a 12-year-old girl. I know that too. He looked at her steadily. But if this case goes the way Webb thinks it can go, she's safer afterward than she's ever been. That's worth 6 weeks. Abby looked at him. He could see the war in it, the pull between now and later, between the thing that could be done immediately and the thing that could actually last. "You're right," she said, and the way she said it told him she meant it, and hated that she meant it in equal measure. He put his hand on her shoulder briefly, just his hand resting there for a moment. 6 weeks, he said. Then we go to Helena together, and you stand in front of a federal judge and you say every word you said to me across that table. She looked up at him. Together, she said. He hadn't thought about how it would sound when he said it. He'd said it because it was true, because he'd already decided it weeks ago, somewhere between the document in the saddlebag and 3 men riding out of the yard. I was there when you told it, he said. I can be there when you tell it again. She looked at him for a long time. The afternoon had gone golden around them, and Ranger stood quiet at the rail, and the mountain was all around them steady and enormous and unchanged. Ethan Walker, she said softly. Abby Morgan, he said. Something passed between them, in the quiet not spoken, not acted on, not made into anything yet. Something acknowledged the way you acknowledge a thing that has been present for a while, and that you've both been careful around, that has grown too solid now to pretend isn't there. She looked down at the letter in his hand. 6 weeks, she said. 6 weeks, he said. She took the letter and walked back toward the cabin, and he stood in the yard with Ranger's reins in his hand and watched her go, and he thought that 6 weeks had never sounded like such a short time and such a long time in the same moment. He thought about Harlan Goss in his Callow Creek office with his lawyers and his influence and his 48-hour warning system inside the federal government. He thought about a 12-year-old girl with a bruise from elbow to shoulder. He thought about a woman who'd stood in a yard and told the man who'd hurt her that she was done being afraid and had meant every word. He put Ranger in the lean-to and went inside. They had 6 weeks. They were going to need every one of them. The 6 weeks didn't pass quietly. Ethan had expected some kind of move from Goss. He'd planned for it in the way he planned for bad weather. Not with panic, but with preparation, checking the things that could be checked, and accepting that some things couldn't. He'd moved the second copy of the documents to a third location. He'd written to Webb twice more short letters factual, updating him on Pruitt's visit with dates and words as close to exact as he could recall. He'd kept the rifle clean and loaded and in a place he could reach it in under 4 seconds from anywhere in the cabin. What he hadn't planned for was what Goss actually did. It came through Ridgefield, not through the mountain. A man named Carver, not one of Goss's usual people, someone hired at a distance, someone with no obvious connection, started asking questions at the Ridgefield post office about letters going to Helena. He didn't ask about Ethan Walker by name. He asked about letters from the mountain properties, the remote ones, ranchers who didn't come to town regular. The postmaster, a small, sharp-eyed man named Horace Greer, who had no particular love for people who came into his post office asking questions that weren't their business, said nothing useful to Carver, and then sent his boy up the mountain trail with a note to Ethan that same afternoon. Ethan read the note and handed it to Abby without comment. She read it and set it on the table. He's trying to find out what we've sent and to who, she said. Yes, which means his man inside the federal office didn't give him specifics, just that a complaint had been filed. That's what I reckon. She thought about it for a moment. Webb needs to know someone's watching the mail routes. Already writing it, Ethan said. He was at the table with the pen. But we can't use Ridgefield anymore. Greer's honest, but he's one man and he can only do so much. There's a postal agent in Mill Haven, she said, 40 miles west. I went through there when I was... She stopped. When I was heading up into the mountains, the agent there, a woman named Ruth Ferris, she was kind to me, asked no questions. He looked up. You trust her? I trusted her instincts, Abby said carefully. That's not the same thing. But she had the look of someone who understood minding her own business. He thought about it. 40 miles was a long ride, but a long ride was less costly than a compromised mail route 3 weeks before a federal hearing. "I'll go tomorrow," he said. "We'll go," she said. He looked at her. "I've been on this mountain for 2 months," she said, and her voice was even and matter-of-fact. "I can ride Ranger now without embarrassing either of us. And 40 miles is a long way for one man to be alone on a road that Goss's hired people are apparently using." He couldn't argue with the logic. He didn't try. They left before dawn. The road to Millhaven ran through the lower valley and then cut west through a stretch of open grassland that gave you a long sight line in every direction which Ethan preferred. He didn't like riding through country where someone could come up close without being seen first. Abby rode beside him, rather than behind, which had stopped being a choice either of them made consciously somewhere in the last few weeks and had just become the way they rode. She sat well in the saddle now, not the careful, deliberate balance of a beginner, but something more settled, more natural, as if the horse had become an extension of her thinking rather than a problem she was managing. They didn't talk much in the first hour. The road was quiet, and the morning was still cool, and the silence between them had long since stopped being the silence of strangers. "I've been thinking about Clara," she said eventually. "I know you have." Webb said he was looking into it, but looking into it and doing something about it are different. She kept her eyes on the road. "Even if the case goes the way we need it to go, even if Goss goes to prison and the bank gets investigated and the foreclosures get reviewed, Clara's father still exists. He's still her father." Ethan thought about that. "You think the mother would take the girl if the father was removed from the picture?" "I think the mother has been trying to protect her since she was born," Abby said. "I think she's been doing it inside a situation that made protecting her almost impossible." She paused. "I'd like to go see her, after, Clara's mother, before we go back to Helena." "Through Callow Creek," he said. Yes. He thought about the risks of that. He thought about what it would cost her to ride into that town after 6 months, to walk down streets where women had crossed to the other side, rather than greet her to go back into the place that had taken everything she'd built and scattered it. He thought about what it would mean to her if she didn't go. "We'll go through Callow Creek," he said. She looked at him sideways. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," he said. "I said we'll go." She looked at him for a moment more. Then she looked back at the road. "Thank you," she said quietly. He touched the brim of his hat, the old instinctive gesture, and she saw it, and something in her face softened in the way it did. Sometimes unexpectedly, briefly, like light through a gap in cloud cover, and then she was looking at the road again, and he was looking at the road, and the morning opened up around them. Ruth Ferris was a compact, silver-haired woman in her 60s who ran the Millhaven Postal Agency out of the back half of a dry goods store and had, as far as Ethan could tell, within 10 minutes of meeting her, precisely 0 patience for anyone who wasted her time. She looked at Ethan. She looked at Abby. She looked at the letter in Ethan's hand, addressed to Aldous Webb in Helena. "Federal business," she said. "Yes, ma'am," Ethan said. "Somebody trying to interfere with it. Somebody asking questions at the Ridgefield post office about our mail," Abby said. "Yes." Ruth Ferris looked at Abby with the particular attention of a woman who had watched a lot of people walk through her door and learned to read them quickly. "You're the school teacher," she said. "From Callow Creek." Abby held very still. "You know about me. I know Harlan Goss has been spreading a particular story about a school teacher who made trouble for him," Ruth said. "I also know Harlan Goss, and I know that when a man like that works that hard to ruin a woman's name, it's because she got close enough to something real to scare him." She took the letter from Ethan's hand. "I'll see this gets to Helena on the government rider that comes through Thursday. No questions asked, no records kept here." Abby stared at her. "Why would you do that?" Ruth Ferris looked at her steadily. "Because somebody should have done it sooner," she said. "And because I've been watching what that man does to people in this valley for 20 years, and I'm 71 years old, and I've got nothing left to lose by being useful." She tucked the letter under the counter. "Now," You want coffee before you ride back. It's a long 40 miles. They had coffee, and sitting in the back of Ruth Ferris's postal agency drinking strong black coffee, while the morning moved toward noon, Abby said very little, but she sat differently than she had before she'd walked in, like something had been added to her rather than taken away. Ethan watched her and didn't say anything about it. But on the ride back, when they were an hour out of Millhaven and the mountain was visible ahead of them in the afternoon light, she said, "There are more people like her, in the valley, people who've been watching Goss and waiting for someone to do something about it who wasn't in his pocket." "Yes," Ethan said. "We've been thinking about this as Abby Morgan against Harlan Goss," she said. "But it's not, is it? It never was." "No," he said. "It was always bigger than that. He made it personal because making it personal is how men like him keep it manageable. Keep you focused on defending yourself instead of looking at how many people are standing behind you." She rode in silence for a moment. "You figured that out the hard way," she said. "With Rebecca, I spent 2 years thinking it was me against the men who killed her," he said. "I was so fixed on them that I couldn't see the shape of the whole thing." He paused. "By the time I understood it, the evidence I had was cold, and the witnesses I needed had moved on." "That's not going to happen this time," she said. He looked at her. "No," he said. "It's not." 3 weeks before the Helena hearing, the first witness broke. Webb sent word one of the 2 women Abby had named a woman called Margaret Shea, who had taught Sunday school alongside Abby, and who had watched the campaign against her from close range, had withdrawn her statement. No explanation given to Webb's man. She'd simply said she'd made a mistake and had nothing further to say. Abby read the letter standing up, and when she finished, she set it down on the table and put both hands flat on the wood and stared at the wall. Ethan waited. "Goss got to her," she said. "Most likely. Margaret has a daughter, 18. Just started working at the hotel Goss owns." She said it without emotion, stating facts, but her hands pressed harder against the table. "He didn't threaten Margaret. He threatened the girl's position." "That's how he works," Ethan said. "That leaves one witness," she said. "Ellen Marsh. If he reaches Ellen—" "We need to get to Ellen first," Ethan said. She looked up at him. "That means going to Callow Creek now. Not after the hearing." He'd already been thinking about it. The calculus wasn't complicated. One witness weakened the case substantially. No witnesses besides Abby herself put everything on her word against Goss's documented influence, his lawyers, his years of carefully constructed respectability. The land fraud records were solid, but a federal jury needed more than documents. They needed a face. They needed someone who had been there, who could look at the jury and say, "I saw this, I know this, this is true. We go in quietly," he said. "Not through the main road. There's a way in along the creek bed on the south side of town that I know from when I used to run cattle through the valley." "Ellen Marsh, where does she live?" "East side of town," Abby said. "Little house set back from the road. Blue door." She was already pulling on her jacket. "She's stubborn, Ellen. More stubborn than Margaret. But she's also alone. If Goss puts enough pressure—" "We go tonight," Ethan said. She stopped moving and looked at him. "Tonight. You want to ride into Callow Creek in the dark." "I want to get to Ellen Marsh before Goss does," he said. "Yes." She considered it for exactly 4 seconds. "All right," she said. "Tonight." They reached the outskirts of Callow Creek close to midnight, coming up along the creek bed the way Ethan had described, and the town was mostly quiet, most of the lights gone out in the houses along the main road. He knew enough about how towns breathed at night to read what was normal and what wasn't. This felt normal, quiet and sleeping and unaware. Abby was tense beside him. He could feel it without looking, the held quality of her posture, the way her breathing had shortened. She'd been here 6 months ago, being run out of it. Coming back in the dark on a borrowed horse was not something a person did without it costing them something. He said her name quietly. She looked at him. "You don't have to come to the door," he said. "I can—" "I'm coming to the door," she said, flat and certain. He nodded and didn't suggest it again. Ellen Marsh's house was exactly as described. East side blue door, set back from the road behind a small garden that even in the dark showed signs of careful tending. Ethan tied the horses in the shadow of the neighboring building, and they went to the door on foot. Abby knocked. Soft, deliberate, the kind of knock that said, "I'm not a threat, but I'm not leaving." Nothing for a moment. Then a light moved inside. "Who's there?" A woman's voice, sharp and awake. The voice of someone who didn't sleep heavily, who had learned not to. "Ellen," Abby said. "It's Abby Morgan." Silence. Then the sound of a bolt being drawn. Ellen Marsh was 50 or so, thin and straight-backed, with gray-streaked hair loose around her shoulders. She looked at Abby, and something complicated moved across her face. Relief and fear arriving at the same time, fighting each other for space. "Abby," she said. "God above, get inside." They stepped in. Ellen closed the door and shot the bolt. She looked at Ethan. "Who's this?" "Ethan Walker," Abby said. "He's the reason I'm alive." Ellen looked at him for 1 second and apparently found what she needed to see in that second, because she said, "Sit down, both of you. I'll put the kettle on." She didn't put the kettle on. She turned and looked at Abby with her hands clasped in front of her and said, "He came to see me." Abby went still. "When?" "4 days ago. Not Goss himself. A lawyer. Very polished. Very pleasant." Ellen's jaw was tight. "Said there'd been some misunderstanding about my statement to the federal man. Said perhaps I'd been confused about what I'd witnessed. Said he hoped I'd have the opportunity to clarify my position before things got complicated." "He threatened you," Abby said. "He was very pleasant about it," Ellen said. "That was the most frightening part." "What did you tell him?" Ellen looked at her steadily. "I told him I'd need to think about it." She paused. "I've been thinking about it for 4 days." She looked at Ethan, then back at Abby. "Is the federal case real? Is it actually going somewhere?" "Grand jury granted a hearing date," Ethan said. 3 weeks out. Helena. Ellen closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, something had settled in them. "Margaret Shea withdrew," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Abby said. Ellen nodded slowly. "Margaret's got the girl to think about. I understand it." She looked at her own hands. "I've got nobody, no children, no family in this territory." She looked up. "Which means I've also got nothing he can use except me, and I have spent 53 years being used by men who were certain I had no other choice." The room went very quiet. "I'm not withdrawing," Ellen said. "I want that to be clear. I was not confused, and I am not going to say I was." Abby crossed the room and took Ellen's hands and held them, and for a moment neither woman said anything. Ethan looked at the wall. Then Abby said quietly, "I need you to do one more thing. I need you to let Webb's man come back and take a new statement. A fuller one. Everything you know about Goss. Not just what you saw with me. Everything." Ellen looked at her. "That's more than I've said to anyone." "I know. That's 20 years of things I've watched and kept quiet about. I know that too." Ellen was quiet for a long moment. "All right," she said. "All right." She squeezed Abby's hands. "You'd better win this thing, Abigail Morgan." "I intend to," Abby said. That's it. They rode back up the mountain in the gray hour before dawn, tired and quiet, and when they got in, Abby sat down in the chair by the cold fireplace and didn't move to build the fire, and Ethan built it without being asked. She watched the fire take and said nothing for a while. Then she said, "She's been holding that for 20 years. "Yes. 20 years of knowing things and having no place to put them. That's what Goss built," Ethan said, sitting down across from her. "Not just influence, not just money. He built a structure where knowing something dangerous had no value because there was nobody safe to tell." She looked at the fire. We changed that. You changed it, he said. I sent a letter. Webb filed paperwork. But you're the one who walked out of that town with nothing and still went to the federal agent instead of just disappearing. She shook her head slowly. I almost just disappeared. But you didn't. She looked at him then, and the fire was between them, and her face was in the light of it, and she looked tired, in the way of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time, and could see the place where they might be able to set it down finally, but wasn't there yet. What happens if we lose? She said. He looked at her steadily. Then we find another way. Ethan, I'm serious, he said. Webb said the land fraud records are solid. Even if the jury won't convict on the witness intimidation, even if they discount your testimony against Goss's lawyers, the land fraud is federal. He goes down for that, or he spends the rest of his life fighting federal investigators. Either way, his influence in Callow Creek breaks. She was quiet for a moment. Clara, she said. Clara's mother has a name now in front of a federal judge, he said. Whatever happens with Goss, her situation is documented in a federal record. That matters. She looked at him for a long time. You've thought about all the ways this could go wrong, she said. I've thought about all the ways, he said, and I keep coming back to the same place. Which is, that you stood in this yard and told Dale Pruitt you were done being afraid, he said. I was watching your hands. They were shaking. You were terrified and you said it anyway. He paused. That's already won, Abby. Whatever happens in Helena, that's already happened. Nobody can take it back. Her throat moved. She looked down at her hands in her lap. The hands that had been shaking in the yard 3 weeks ago, that had held tight to a leather bag on a mountainside, that had gripped a fireplace poker behind a cabin door. I need to sleep, she said finally. Yes, he said. And then I need to write to Webb about Ellen. In the morning, he said. She looked up at him, and for just a moment, one unguarded, undefended moment, she let him see exactly how much this had cost her. Not the fear, not the anger. The plain exhaustion of a person who has been fighting for a long time and is almost at the end of what fighting costs. He looked back at her with the same plainness. No reassurance, no performance. Just present, just here, just a man who had decided not to look away. Ethan, she said. I know, he said. She nodded once. She went to bed, and he sat by the fire until it burned low, and he thought about Helena and federal judges and 20 years of Ellen Marsh's silence finally finding a room large enough to hold it. He thought about a 12-year-old girl with a bruise on her arm. He thought about Abby's hands. The way they'd unclenched. Outside the mountain was dark and enormous, and entirely indifferent the way it had always been. But inside the cabin, the fire gave its warmth without asking anything in return, and somewhere on the other side of 6 weeks, there was a courtroom in Helena, where Abigail Morgan was going to stand up and say every true thing she knew in front of a federal judge. Ethan Walker was going to be in that room. He'd already decided. He put another piece of wood on the fire and sat back and let the mountain breathe around him. And for the first time in 4 years, he found that the silence didn't feel like something he was enduring. It felt like something he was keeping safe. The morning they left for Helena. Abby was up before Ethan for the first time in weeks. He heard her moving before first light. The careful, deliberate sounds of someone who was trying not to wake anyone, which told him she hadn't slept. He lay still and listened to her fill the kettle and set it on the fire and pull on her boots, and he thought about saying something and decided against it. She didn't need words right now. She needed the 15 minutes before dawn to make whatever peace she was going to make with the day. He got up when the kettle started. She was standing by the window with her back to him, both hands wrapped around a cup, and she didn't turn when he came in, but she said, I keep thinking I'm forgetting something. You've checked the documents 3 times, he said. They're in the saddlebag. I know. Ellen's statement is with Webb already. I know that too. She turned then, and she looked tired but clear-eyed the way a person looks when they've worked through something during the night and come out the other side, not rested but resolved. I keep thinking about what Goss's lawyer is going to say about me, the things on record, the things Goss made sure got on record. Ethan poured his coffee and sat down. Tell me what you're most afraid of. She looked at him. There was a period, she said carefully, before I came to Callow Creek. Before the teaching position. I was in a bad situation. I made choices that a federal lawyer could characterize in a way that... She stopped. They weren't shameful choices. They were survival choices. But shame doesn't care about the difference. No, he said, it doesn't. Goss's lawyer will find them, she said. He's had months. He'll put them in front of the jury as evidence of character. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, When Webb asked you about your background in this cabin, did you tell him? She hesitated. The main points. All of them. A longer pause. Most of them. He set down his cup. Abby, if Goss's lawyer finds something Webb doesn't already know, it's 100 times worse than if Webb already knows it and has had time to prepare for it. She looked at him, and he could see the thing she'd been carrying all night right there in her face. Not the secret itself, but the weight of it, the exhaustion of managing it alone. I know, she said quietly. I know that. Then we stop in Ridgefield on the way, and you write Webb a letter, he said. All of it, whatever it is. You give him every piece of it, and you let him decide what to do with it. What if it changes things? Then it changes things and we deal with what comes next, he said. But hiding it changes things worse. She looked at him for a long moment. Her chin came up in the particular way it did when she was taking something on, accepting a hard thing, and straightening under it. All right, she said. All right, he said. He finished his coffee. She finished hers. They rode out as the first light came over the ridge, and she was quiet for the first hour. And he let her be quiet. And when they stopped in Ridgefield, she went to the back room of Greer's post office, and she wrote Webb a letter that took her 45 minutes to write. And when she came out, her hands were steady, and her jaw was set, and she looked like someone who had just put down something very heavy. Done, he said. Done, she said. They rode on. Helena was 3 days' ride from the mountain, and they made good time the first 2 days, stopping at a way station the first night and a small hotel in a town called Brent's Crossing. The second. Ethan paid for 2 rooms without making anything of it, and she took her key and said goodnight, and he lay in his room, listening to the sounds of a town that wasn't his mountain, and found them harder to sleep through than he'd expected. On the third morning, 2 hours outside Helena, a rider came up fast behind them on the road. Ethan heard the horse before he saw it. Heard the pace of it too fast for casual travel, the deliberate speed of someone with a purpose, and he moved Ranger to the side of the road and put his hand near his rifle without drawing it, because there was no reason to assume the worst until you had to. The rider pulled up hard when he saw them. Young man, maybe 25, dusty from a long ride. He had a federal courier's badge on his coat. Looking for Ethan Walker and Abigail Morgan? He said, breathing hard. You found them, Ethan said. The courier reached into his coat and pulled out a sealed letter. From Agent Webb. He said it was urgent. He said to make sure you read it before you got to Helena. Ethan took the letter and handed it to Abby. She broke the seal and read it, and he watched her face, and what he saw there made his stomach drop before she said a word. She lowered the letter. Goss withdrew his response, she said. Ethan stared at her. What? His lawyer filed a withdrawal 3 days ago. She looked at the letter again, like she was checking she'd read it correctly. He's not contesting the federal complaint. The courier nodded. Agent Webb says there's more. He wants you in his office before the hearing. Webb's office in Helena was on the second floor of a stone building that smelled like paper and old wood, and the particular institutional seriousness of federal work. Webb was standing when they came in, and he didn't waste time on pleasantries. Sit down, he said. Both of you. There's a lot to cover. They sat. 3 days ago, Webb said, a man named Thomas Briggs walked into the federal land office in Helena and asked to speak to an agent. He looked at Abby. Clara's father. Abby went very still. He came of his own accord, Webb said. No lawyer. No prior contact from my office. He sat down at my colleague's desk and he talked for 4 hours. Webb opened the ledger on his desk. Thomas Briggs has been working for Harlan Goss for 9 years. In that time, he's witnessed, participated in, and in 3 cases directly executed actions on Goss's behalf that constitute fraud coercion, and in 1 instance, what my colleague believes may constitute conspiracy in a wrongful death. The word landed in the room like a stone in still water. Ethan felt something move through him, cold and sharp and very still. Whose death? He said. Webb looked at him steadily. A rancher named Calhoun, 2 years ago. Property on the East Ridge. He paused. Briggs says he drove the man's wagon off a mountain road on Goss's orders. The room was completely silent. Ethan's hands were flat on his knees. He was breathing through his nose very deliberately because what was moving through him right now was not something he could afford to let out in this room. Calhoun, he said. His voice came out even. He was proud of that. Single man. No family. Wife? Webb said. Deceased before him. No children. He paused. I'm sorry, Walker. I know what you're thinking. You don't, Ethan said quietly. But it doesn't matter. Abby put her hand on his arm. Just her hand resting there, not saying anything. He looked down at it, and then he looked at the wall, and he breathed through it all the way through it, until the cold thing settled back down to where he could manage it. Rebecca's death. A mountain road. A man paid to do it. He'd known. He'd known for 4 years that it wasn't an accident, and he hadn't been able to prove it, and he'd come to the mountain and tried to make peace with never proving it. Thomas Briggs had just proved it. Walker, Webb said carefully. What Briggs gave us changes the shape of this case entirely. Goss withdrew his response because his lawyer got wind that Briggs had come in. He's trying to cut his losses, distance himself from the fraud charges before the criminal charges land. It won't work, Ethan said. No, Webb agreed. It won't. Criminal conspiracy, wrongful death, federal land fraud, witness intimidation. Goss isn't cutting losses. He's choosing which fire to burn in. Webb looked at both of them. The hearing today becomes something different than we planned. It's no longer a civil complaint about land fraud. It's the beginning of a criminal case. The judge will hear the initial complaint and then refer it to a federal prosecutor. Abby had her hand still on Ethan's arm. She hadn't moved it. What does that mean for my testimony? She said. It means your testimony today establishes the pattern, Webb said. Witness intimidation, reputational destruction. The threat Pruitt made, these are evidence of how Goss operates. They support the criminal case. He looked at her directly. You're not the only voice in that room today, Miss Morgan, but your voice is what started all of this. I need you to know that. She looked at him for a moment. What about Clara? Webb's expression shifted. Briggs is cooperating because of Clara, he said quietly. He said, and I'm repeating his words exactly, he said he didn't realize until his daughter came home from school one day and told him that her teacher had reported his employer to the sheriff and been destroyed for it. He said he'd been telling himself for 9 years that what he did for Goss didn't touch his family. Webb paused. He said watching what Goss did to you made him understand that nothing he'd done for Goss had kept Clara safe. It had just made her world smaller. Abby made a sound, just one small sound, and pressed her free hand over her mouth. Ethan looked at the ceiling. The ceiling of Webb's federal office was plain whitewashed plaster, and it told him nothing, which was what he needed right now. A 12-year-old girl came home from school and told her father that her teacher had stood up and been punished for it. And that had been the thing. That of all the things, not Webb's investigation, not Ethan's letter, not Ellen Marsh's 20 years of stored knowledge. A girl coming home and telling her father a story about a woman who didn't look away. He looked back down. What time is the hearing? He said. 2 o'clock. Webb said. Ethan looked at Abby. She had taken her hand from her mouth. She was composed again the way she always came back to composed, not because she didn't feel things, but because she'd learned long ago that feeling things and functioning weren't mutually exclusive. "Then we have time to eat something," Ethan said. "And I'd like to clean up before I sit in a federal courtroom." Something happened in Abby's face that was almost a smile. "You're thinking about washing your face," she said. "I've been on the road 3 days," he said. "Yes." She did smile then, small and real and slightly dazed. "All right," she said. "Let's go wash our faces." The federal courthouse in Helena was the most formal building Ethan had been inside in years, and he was aware of his boots on the marble floor in a way that would have irritated him 6 months ago, and now just was what it was. He was here. That was the only thing that mattered. Abby walked beside him in a dark dress that Ellen Marsh had sent to Millhaven through Ruth Ferris 2 weeks prior. A good dress, plain and well made, the kind of dress that said, "I am a serious person, and I am here on serious business." She wore her hair pinned back exactly the way she must have worn it when she stood in front of a classroom, and she walked with the posture of someone who had decided fully and finally decided that they were done apologizing for taking up space. Ethan thought she was the most formidable person he'd ever seen walk through a door. He didn't say so. She didn't need to hear it from him right now. She needed to be inside her own head. The hearing room was smaller than Ethan expected. Not a full courtroom. A hearing room with a long table and a federal judge at the head of it, and Webb and another agent on one side, and Goss's 2 lawyers on the other, and a court reporter in the corner with her fingers already poised. Goss himself was not present. Ethan hadn't known whether he would be. When he registered the absence, he felt something that wasn't quite disappointment. More like the knowledge that this was not going to be the kind of confrontation where you looked the man in the eye. This was going to be the kind where you laid out the truth methodically and let the system grind on it. He could live with that. He sat behind Abby and Webb, and he kept his hands loose on his knees, and he watched. Abby testified for 1 hour and 40 minutes. She was not the woman who had been lying unconscious on a mountainside. She was not the woman who had grabbed his wrist and begged him not to look. She was not even the woman who had stood in the yard, shaking after Pruitt rode away. She was all of those women and something more than any of them, something that had been built out of all of it. And she spoke in a clear, level voice, and she did not flinch from a single question. Goss's lawyer was good. Ethan had expected him to be. He came at her character at the period she'd mentioned to Ethan on the road, and she met it without flinching. "Yes," she said when the lawyer laid it out. "That is accurate. I was in that situation. I made those choices. I would make them again because the alternative was worse, and I am not ashamed of surviving." She looked at the lawyer steadily. "If your client had been in my position, I imagine he would have made the same choices or worse. The difference is that he has never been in a position where survival required anything of him beyond intimidating people with less power." The court reporter's fingers didn't stop moving. The lawyer tried twice more. Both times she answered in the same way, direct, factual, unashamed. Not aggressive, not emotional. Just a woman who had decided that the truth was the only thing she had to work with, and she was going to work with it completely. When she was done, the judge looked at his papers for a long moment. Then he looked up. "The complaint is substantiated," he said. "I'm referring this matter to the federal prosecutor's office with a recommendation for criminal charges." He looked at Goss's lawyers. "Counsel, your client should be aware that the scope of the federal inquiry will now expand to include all matters referenced in the supplementary testimony received this week." He meant Briggs. He meant Rebecca. He meant Calhoun. Goss's lead lawyer said something in a controlled voice about his client's intention to cooperate fully. The judge looked at him with the expression of a man who had been on the federal bench for 20 years and had heard that particular sentence from that particular kind of lawyer more times than he could count. "See that he does," the judge said. They were outside on the courthouse steps when the weight of it finally hit Abby. Not dramatically, not in the way of a person collapsing. It hit her the way a long tension releases suddenly all at once, and the body doesn't know what to do with the absence of what it's been bracing against. She sat down on the courthouse steps because her legs said so, and she put her elbows on her knees and her face in her hands, and she sat like that for a moment. Ethan sat down beside her. He didn't put his arm around her. He didn't say anything. He just sat beside her on the federal courthouse steps in Helena, Montana, in the afternoon of a summer day, and he was present, and he was solid, and he was there. After a while, she lifted her face from her hands. Her eyes were wet, but she hadn't properly cried. She had the look of someone who was going to cry later privately when she'd given herself permission. "Clara's father is going to testify," she said. "Yes. He came in because of her," she said. "Because she came home from school and told him what happened to me." "Yes." She shook her head slowly. "I thought I failed her. I thought the whole time I thought leaving was failing her." "You didn't leave her," Ethan said. "You went somewhere you could breathe long enough to do this." She looked at him. "That's a generous interpretation." "It's the accurate one," he said. She looked out at the street at Helena, moving through its afternoon business people and horses, and the sounds of a functioning town ordinary and indifferent and alive. "Rebecca," she said quietly. "What Briggs said." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes." "Are you all right?" He thought about it honestly, the way he tried to think about hard things directly without performing. "I've known for 4 years," he said. "Having it confirmed is different than knowing. But I'm not." He stopped. "I don't feel what I expected to feel." "What do you feel?" He looked at his hands. "Like something finished," he said. "Like a thing that had been open for a long time, just—" He stopped again because he wasn't sure he had the words for it. "Closed." She reached over and covered his hands with both of hers, and they sat like that on the courthouse steps for a minute with the afternoon sun on them, two people who had carried heavy things for a long time, sitting in the quiet that came after. "What happens now?" she said. "Goss goes through the federal prosecutor," he said. "It'll take time. His lawyers will fight it. But Webb says the land fraud charges alone are solid enough to strip the bank. Once the bank goes, the council goes, the sheriff goes. The whole structure he built falls over because it was always held up by money and fear, and neither of those holds in a federal court." "And Dale Pruitt," she said. "Conspiracy to intimidate a federal witness," Ethan said. "Webb said it's the cleaner charge." She nodded slowly. Then she said, "I want to go back through Callow Creek. I want to see Clara's mother before we go back to the mountain." "I know," he said. "We'll go." She looked at him. "And then?" He looked back at her. This woman who had changed every single quiet thing about his life on the mountain, the evenings, the meals, the way the cabin felt when he came back to it, the way the silence had weight and warmth instead of just weight. "And then we go home," he said. She held his gaze. "Home," she said, like she was testing the weight of it. Like it was a word she'd stopped letting herself use, and was picking it up again carefully to see if it still held. "The mountain," he said. "If you want it to be." She looked at him for a long, clear, undefended moment. "I want it to be," she said. They rode into Callow Creek the next morning, and it was the first time Abby Morgan had been on that main road in 7 months, and Ethan rode beside her and watched her face, and didn't look away. She looked. She looked at every building and every face, and she didn't look down. Some people stopped. Some people stared. A woman in front of the dry goods store started to turn away, and then stopped herself, and Abby nodded to her once without stopping, and kept riding. Clara Briggs's mother was a small, worn woman named Ida, and she came to the door when Abby knocked, and she looked at her for a long moment, and then she pulled her inside, and held on to her like she was something she'd been afraid she'd never see again. Clara was at the kitchen table. She was 12 years old, and she had her father's coloring and her mother's eyes, and she looked at Abby with the particular look of a child who has been waiting a very long time for something she didn't know how to name. "You came back," Clara said. "I told you I would," Abby said. Ethan stood in the doorway and watched this, and he thought that if there was a reason for all of it, for the letter, for the mountain, for 4 years of silence that had been waiting for exactly this, it was in the look on that child's face when she said, "You came back." He looked away. He looked down the main street of Callow Creek at the bank building with Goss's name on it that would not have that name much longer at the sheriff's office, that would have a different sheriff inside it before the year was out. At the ordinary morning business of a town that had been held in place by one man's gravity and was about to have to figure out how to stand on its own. He thought about his father. A man's character isn't what he does when people are watching. It's what he does when there's nobody around to see. There had been nobody watching on that mountainside when he'd picked her up. There had been nobody watching when he'd written the letter and signed his name to it. There had been nobody watching in those first careful weeks when he'd given her the room she needed and the time she needed and kept his own wants entirely out of it. He had not done those things to be seen. He had done them because they were the things that needed doing. That was the only kind of accounting that had ever made sense to him. 10. They stayed in Callow Creek 2 days. On the second day, Ellen Marsh came to find Abby at the hotel, and they sat together for 2 hours. And when Abby came back, she had something in her face that Ethan had not seen there before. Something lighter. Not the absence of everything she'd been carrying, but a different relationship to the weight. The look of someone who had stopped carrying it alone. Margaret Shea came on the second afternoon. She came quietly to the back door of the hotel, and she stood in the hallway with her hands twisted together, and she said, "I know I didn't. I know what I did," with the statement. "I know why you did it," Abby said. "It wasn't right." "No," Abby said, "but I understand it." Margaret looked at her with the expression of someone who had expected harder judgment and didn't know what to do with the lack of it. "Is there anything?" she started. "Talk to Webb's man when he comes back through," Abby said. "Tell him what you know, not for me, for the record, because it matters that the record is complete." Margaret nodded, twice quickly, then she left. Abby watched her go and then turned back to Ethan and said, "She'll do it." "I reckon she will," he said. She almost smiled. "You've been saying reckon more lately." "I've been spending time with someone who doesn't say it enough," he said. She did smile then, full and real and unguarded, and he looked at it and let himself look at it directly for once, without the careful sideways management. They left Callow Creek on a Thursday morning the same way they'd arrived together, riding side by side on the road. But different. They rode back through the valley and up the lower switchback and through the pines and over the ridge and down the other side to the 40 acres that Ethan Walker had built a life out of when he'd had nothing else left, and Ranger knew the way so well he could have made it in the dark, and the cabin was there the way it always was, plain and practical and sound. Abby swung down from her horse and stood in the yard and looked at it. He stood beside her. "The garden's going to need work," she said. "We've been gone almost 2 weeks." "It'll survive," he said. "The carrot row might not." "Abby." She looked at him. He looked at her. This woman, this specific, particular, extraordinary woman, standing in his yard in the afternoon of a summer day, her boots dusty from a long road, and her chin up and her eyes clear. "I'd like you to stay," he said. "Not as a guest, not as someone hiding, as—" He stopped because he was a plain man, and plain men didn't always have the right words, and he'd rather say the true thing imperfectly than the polished thing that wasn't true. "As the person who lives here, if you want that, if this is where you want to be." She looked at him for a long moment. "You built this place alone," she said. "I did." "Because you needed somewhere that was yours." "Yes. And you're asking me to be part of it." "Yes," he said. She looked at the cabin, at the garden, at the lean-to where Ranger was already nosing toward his usual spot, at the bench on the south wall where they'd sat on summer evenings, watching the dark come in. "I came to this mountain running," she said quietly. "I know." "I don't want to be the woman who came here running," she said. "I want to be the woman who chose to be here, "Those aren't the same person," he said. "But they're the same woman." She looked at him. He took one step toward her, and she took one step toward him, and he put his hand against her face. Just his hand, his thumb along her cheekbone, the way he would touch something he had decided to take care of for the rest of his life. She closed her eyes for 1 second. Then she opened them, and she looked at him with everything, with the mountain school teacher, and the frightened woman on the mountainside, and the person who had stood in a federal hearing room and said every true thing she knew, all of it at once, all of her. "I choose to be here," she said. He kissed her the way he did most things that mattered, without ceremony, without performance. Just fully present, just entirely certain. When he stepped back, she was looking at him with that expression she sometimes got, the one he'd stopped being surprised by, the one that said she was measuring something and had found it adequate. "The carrot row," she said. "The carrot row." He agreed. She went to the garden. He went to the lean-to to settle the horses, and the mountain went on around them, the way it always had, enormous and indifferent and ancient, and inside that enormity. Two people moved through the late afternoon, doing the small necessary work of a life, and the cabin held its warmth. The way good things hold warmth, without asking to be thanked for it, without requiring any witness. Just real, just present, just here. That winter, a letter came from Webb. Harlan Goss had been indicted on 11 counts. The bank had been placed under federal receivership. Dale Pruitt had entered a guilty plea on 2 counts of federal witness intimidation. The sheriff of Callow Creek had resigned before charges could be formally filed and had left the territory. Thomas Briggs had testified fully and completely, and in exchange for his cooperation had been given a reduced sentence that allowed him to remain in Callow Creek. With Goss's property empire dismantled, he had found work with a legitimate ranching operation east of town. Clara and her mother were still in the house with the blue door. Webb had added one line at the bottom of the letter below his signature, in the slightly different slant of someone who had decided to say something that wasn't strictly official. The school teacher from Callow Creek gave this valley something it hasn't had in 20 years. "I thought you should both know that I understand what it cost her." Abby read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in the small chest she kept at the foot of the bed, where she kept the things that mattered. Ethan watched her do it. "You're not going to say anything," he said. "I don't need to say anything," she said. She looked at him across the cabin that was theirs now in every possible meaning of the word, in every dish and book and repaired piece of tack and jar of preserved vegetables and evening by the fire. "It's done," she said. "It's actually done." "Yes," he said. She looked at the window. Outside, the mountain was deep in its first winter snow, and the pines were white-loaded, and the air was still and cold and clean. "I used to think the story I was living was the one Goss wrote about me," she said. "The woman who made trouble. The woman who ran." She paused. "I'm not that story." "No," he said. "I'm this one," she said simply. He looked at her. At the fire. At the cabin that had been silent for 4 years and was silent differently now, the silence of a place that was full, not empty. "Yes," he said. "You are." She came and sat beside him on the bench before the fire, and he put his arm around her, and she leaned into his side with the ease of someone who had finally fully allowed herself to stop holding herself apart from the thing she wanted, and the fire gave its warmth, and the mountain held them in its enormous, ancient, indifferent hand, and neither of them said anything more. Because in the end, the people who survive the hardest things aren't the strongest people or the luckiest or the ones with the most to fight with. They're the ones who find in the middle of the worst of it one true thing to hold on to. Ethan Walker had held on to the belief that a man's character was what he did when nobody was watching. Abigail Morgan had held on to the belief that a girl with a bruise on her arm deserved someone who wouldn't look away. And on a mountain in Montana in the summer of 1884, two people who had each been broken by the world in different ways looked at each other and decided without ceremony and without any guarantee that whatever came next, they would face it from the same ground. That was enough. That was everything.